This is episode 59 of a series where we examine the cut content, design, and development of Fallout New Vegas. FNV was only shown publicly a few times before its release, but unlike most games that only preview locations near completion, many of its areas were presented in an early state. As a result, many of them appear differently in-game than how they were first shown, and in today's episode, we're taking an in-depth look into some of these changes. There were concrete planters placed in a line outside Camp McCarran during the documentary, but all of these would later be cut. They're also shown in a different position during the game's intro video, suggesting the environment was reworked before they were cut completely. Two of these planters used a unique upside-down model that isn't used anywhere else, so when they were cut, the model became completely unused. There's a stack of tires that was cut from the camp's entrance, but it can still be found by entering Camp McCarran and then clipping out of bounds. There were also some traffic cones and graffiti shown nearby in early footage, but neither appears in the final game. There were also at least 3 flaming barrels around here, but they got the axe too. The intro video also shows a police car outside Camp McCarran, but it would later be changed into a junk car. It seems there were once many more exploding vehicles in the wasteland, but they were later replaced by non-exploding versions, presumably because the latter is a less expensive object. Another example of this is outside Prem, where in early footage an exploding car was shown, but it's a junk car in the final game. The April edition of PC Gamer magazine had one of the first previews of FNV, and it had a very interesting section on Goodsprings. Joining up with the attackers makes anyone left alive in Goodsprings hate you. They'll either attack you on sight, hire mercenaries to track you down, or offer tribute to buy their safety. That last part is a reference to the Tribute of Terror, a cut series of lines that were meant to play if the player attacked the citizens of Goodsprings. These unused lines are still in the game, and after receiving enough negative reputation, a settler would approach the player and say these lines.
Please don't hurt us no more. I'm begging you.
We'll pay you. Whatever we got, you can have it. We'll put together a collection every couple of days.
We'll leave it under a rock beneath the old windmill. Think of it as a sign of respect.
A mesh was made for the tribute crate, but it remains unused in the game files. The magazine mentions the people of Goodsprings hiring mercenaries to attack you, something that never happens in the final game. It's too bad this didn't make it in, because the rewards and consequences of the Goodsprings questline are very unbalanced. If the player helps the Powder Gangers, they receive a 50% discount at Chet's store. If you help the Settlers, you receive 250 caps from Ringo, and potentially some items by passing skill checks. If mercenaries were sent to attack you, it would have balanced the 50% discount a little better. As it is though, there's not much reason to side with the settlers in the final game, at least when looking at the rewards themselves. There was meant to be a shovel at the Goodsprings Cemetery. It's still placed in the world and is linked to the cut in-game intro cinematic. It's tied to an activator parent, and since the related scripts aren't used, it never appears. There was more clutter around Goodsprings, like this barrel outside the general store, a picnic table in the alley between the general store and the saloon, an additional crate, and a stack of tires outside the saloon, all of which are missing in the final game. There's a couple buckets beneath the ground by Goodsprings source, which I assume were visible at one point but were later moved underground by mistake. At the location Powder Ganger Camp West, there were 2 beer bottles on this table and 2 ammo containers beside it, but both were later deleted. In the King's School of Impersonation, there were once 2 additional beers and a radio on the table in the lobby. Caesar's tent originally had a dresser beside his bed, but this never appeared in any version of the game. This magazine scan of Novak shows a wall of junk cars that was cut from the final game. It also shows some sandbags outside the motel's entrance that were later deleted. This image shows some picnic tables between the motel and bungalow houses, but they never appeared here in any released version of the game. In this early preview, there's a shed on the side of Nipton's general store, but it's missing in-game. This image is potentially interesting, as it might show the player using the cut, generic version of the weapon, this machine. This machine is named Weapon NV Battle Rifle Unique in the GEC, suggesting there was supposed to be a generic, non-unique version of the weapon in the core game. The generic battle rifle would later be added in the Gunrunners DLC. Despite not existing in the core game, the weapon is still mentioned in a note found at Camp McCarran, further implying it was meant to appear prior to the DLCs. The first trailer for FNV showed a different layout of Helios 1. Most notably, there were shacks built over the NCR beds. In the final game, they sleep out in the open in the desert, which I always thought was strange. Beside the tower, there's an empty concrete platform, but in early footage of the area, there were 4 industrial machines here. Beyond these machines, there was also a staircase that led to the back entrance. There were also diesel tanks near the stairs, but they were removed as well. In the Top's lobby, there are 3 telephones, but there were meant to be 3 lamps here as well. All of these are still present in the final game, but they're always disabled. We've already looked at many differences between the Wasteland world space and the Mini world space, but there's still a few more interesting aspects of it we haven't gotten into. The interiors of Crimson Caravan and North Vegas are both in the Mini world space, and were placed close enough together that it created issues. That's to say, while you were in Crimson Caravan, the NPCs in North Vegas were all active, which increased load times and decreased the frame rate. The same thing would happen in reverse if you were in North Vegas. A patch would later disable the NPCs in North Vegas when you enter Crimson Caravan and vice versa. There's a streetlight outside North Vegas that's in a different position in the Wasteland than it is in the Mini world space, but it's difficult to say what's going on here. There are streetlights outside Crimson Caravan in the Mini world space that aren't in the Wasteland, and now only exist in a place where the player will never see them. The area around Westside suffered as well. There's a barricade by Westside's west entrance. If you enter Westside's interior and then clip out of bounds, you'll find 2 sandbags and a ramp that were deleted from the Wasteland. There's an overturned white semi-trailer near Westside, but in the Mini world space it's blue. Presumably this was an aesthetic change. One of the buildings near Westside used a completely different model in early footage than it does in the final game. The layout around NCR sharecropper farms changed significantly at some point in development. The way the roads appear on the world map is notably different from how the area appears in-game. It shows 2 roads cutting through the area where the farms are placed, but both of these are completely missing in-game. Modder Ludo made this awesome graphic to illustrate how these early roads appeared. In the early Remnants map, the monorail is also shown cutting through this area, meaning that this area was originally occupied by 2 roads and a monorail. In the documentary, a clip was shown near the sharecropper farms, and there's a strange retaining wall and pipe blocking the road north. Both of these are in the final game, but they were shifted over so they're not blocking the road anymore. This also appears to show the monorail running along the path shown in the Remnants map. It's possible NCR sharecropper farms were only added to the game much later in development, which would explain why the layout changed so drastically. The area isn't present on the Res 2013 map, so this is a definite possibility. In this beta image of Neil, he's using the Fallout 3 Super Mutant model, implying that this was so early in development that their new model hadn't been completed yet. You can also clearly see the stock of a Chinese assault rifle slung over his back. It's possible they considered including this weapon at one point, but it's more likely an early placeholder weapon. This image shows a much more desaturated color palette at Black Mountain, and I think I actually prefer this vibe over how it ended up. This footage from the documentary shows a barricade at Nellis Air Force Base, but it's not there in the final game. The documentary showed a very early version of Freeside, where there were rocks floating around the Lucky 38. I'm not sure what's going on here or how this made it into the official documentary, but it's pretty fitting for a game that was completely broken at launch. This magazine scan seems to be the very first time the strip was ever shown publicly, and is probably the earliest version of it that we'll ever see, short of an extremely early build being leaked. There's a light beneath the ground on the strip near the Ultralux. It's a part of the planner model, which is presumably why it was never moved above ground. There's also a note that can be found nearby. This isn't cut, but it's difficult to see and is basically camouflaged. I played FNV for over 10 years without noticing this until it was pointed out by modder El Pascal, and I love how there are hidden gems to discover after all this time. During the making of documentary, an alternate running animation for when NPCs have a knife equipped was shown. The player actually runs with the knife rather than holding it out in front of them, and it looks great. This animation never appeared in-game, however, and Fallout 3's animation was reused instead. Another running animation was shown during this clip in Freeside, and the movement looks much more natural than what ended up being used. It's unknown why these were removed, but like most cuts, it was likely due to FNV's accelerated development. Lead producer Jason Bergman revealed there was a bug in early development where certain assets would duplicate themselves infinitely, and this shot shows never-ending peace signs. This image is from so early in development that the prison blocks hadn't been added in at NCR Correctional Facility. This early footage shows Doc Mitchell without gloves and some very creepy oversized hands. If someone restores creepy-handed head-spinning Doc Mitchell in a mod, I'll personally send you 500 bottle caps. In early previews of FNV, it still used the exact same HUD design as Fallout 3. The Western default color is the most obvious difference, but there's actually some very subtle differences that very few players have probably noticed. Josh Sawyer revealed why it was altered. I'm not sure when it was changed, but I worked with Jason Sereno, our UI artist, to make a few adjustments. I didn't want to go crazy with changes, but a small tweak to the aesthetic seemed like a good idea. For several years, I thought this image was an early screenshot of a cut dialogue setup, but it turns out it's actually a very weird piece of pop culture. To hype FNV's release, there was a contest where you answered Doc Mitchell's questions on a promotional website. If you won, you got the chance to play New Vegas in Las Vegas at Kim Kardashian's birthday party. Totally bizarre. Thankfully, many of these cuts were restored by Umbersona's mod, Prerelease Restored. This is probably one of the most underrated FNV mods, and its attention to detail is staggering. The only real issue is that the objects that were restored weren't nav-meshed, but that's a small price to pay for all it does. If you're interested in checking it out, there's a link below in the description. Unfortunately, there were many areas that were never shown in early footage, and we'll likely never know how they were altered in performance passes. Cutting an object here and there isn't a big deal, but when you consider this happening to every single exterior area, it significantly affected the world. These changes would have made FNV into an even better game. Ultimately though, all of this was left on the cutting room floor.